Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Experiential Realism. I'm Arlindo, the philosophical artist, and joining me here today is Professor Philip Clayton, a philosopher of science, a philosopher of religion, and having received a joint PhD from Yale, and he currently holds the Ingraham Chair at Claremont School of Theology. Hi, Professor Philip Clayton. Welcome. It's an honor to have you here on this show.
Hey, thanks,
And
Alindo. It's fun to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to start off by talking about consciousness. I mean, consciousness is very mysterious. How would you define consciousness? What is consciousness to you? How is it
Mhm.
best defined?
Well, as I'm looking at your face behind you, I see a reproduction of neurons, presumably from a human brain, a larger axon, and that is a helpful place to start. We know that this topic begins in a very concrete way, and it ends in mysterious and possibly ineffable and extremely startling ways, which is one of the things I like about your show, is that you're exploring all along this axial net from the beginning. So I would start with the first unicellular organism. And there are lots of theories about how it came out, but let's imagine we're to the point when there's a single cell. It's got a little flagellum, a little chemical motor behind it.
Yeah,
Um, Absolutely simple framework. It's a single cell. And I want to say, along with a school called biosemiotics, that there is a proto-consciousness in the very first living thing. Not that it has the aspects of consciousness for us, but it has a relationship to its surrounding world, and it interacts with goals that are built in by its biological nature. If it swims up a glucose gradient, gets more nutrition, then it reproduces more quickly, and here we go up the evolutionary ladder. If it swims up a gradient of toxins, then it dies, something you can't say of any atom or molecule by itself, and it doesn't succeed to move on up that ladder. That relationship of it to its environment over the billions of years becomes more and more complex in the various organisms. We could reproduce that history if we wanted to.
yeah,
We have some awareness in, say, chimpanzees. We'll talk about maybe later about Jane Goodall's experience with the spirituality of chimpanzees or of animals. But
right.
certainly in humans, that awareness of our relationship to our environment is mediated through a sense of self, self-awareness, and the fact that others have awareness as well as the emergence of philosophy, that is, questions about what the hell is the whole of this anyway? So how's
Right.
it? Let me just stop there as far as locating the question from my perspective and
Yeah,
see where it takes you.
I see. Um, I'm having trouble trying to understand proto-consciousness. Is it some kind of very simple form of consciousness, or is it something from unconscious, like the organism, say, a unicellular life form, isn't aware of absolutely anything until it comes into contact with its environment, and the more it um, comes into contact with it, and the more sensory data it receives, it becomes more aware of itself and also its environment, and also aware of itself in relation to its environment. Is it something like that? And the more it goes along and interacts with more things from the environment, the the greater the consciousness becomes, or consciousness goes up from a very simple form to a more complex one, like
Right.
going from a unicellular organism to a human being, say.
Mhm.
Would you say that's accurate?
Right. So there are religious traditions that would say it is fully conscious, in has awareness. There are many students in my intro to philosophy classes who will say, well, yeah, every cell in my body is conscious.
Yeah.
What I introduced the example to say is that consciousness has to do with the relationship between a biological organism on which Darwinian forces act and its surrounding environment. And at what point you actually push the button and say, now it's conscious, is one of the most interesting empirical and philosophical questions. I think that we would want to say proto-conscious, which means it isn't itself conscious, but it's a long process of evolution that produces that in the end. Let's imagine we had a 10-point scale of consciousness where some universal divine being was 10 on 10 on the scale. This little thing is 0.00001. What's interesting though is to ask, is there a continuum of beings in relationship with their environment such that there is no particular point where there's an off-on switch? And just to make it really clear, my thesis is, and against some of the panpsychists, that the on-off switch starts with the first single-celled organism because it has a relationship to an environment that's qualitatively different than any electron or molecule.
Right. You see the piece of brain that makes up my background. It's
Yep,
actually
yep,
it's a computer generated reconstruction of a cubic millimeter of human cortex. So you can already
yep,
tell there's like thousands of cells and billions of synapses and
yep.
connections, right? And it's only 1 cubic millimeter. And it got removed, presumably got removed from the brain of a living person. And it was, scaled up under an electron microscope. And I question myself because under physicalism, they say complexity is what creates consciousness. So matter comes first, and then you get complexity. And somehow they say they don't explain it because it's what's called promissory physicalism. Somehow consciousness arises from all that complexity. And I
Yeah.
look at my background. And I'm thinking it's only a cubic millimeter of brain, and it's impressive. Look at all that complexity, and it's almost convincing that all that complexity could give rise to something magical, something illusory or mysterious like consciousness, or something that almost seems like spirit. But as Daniel Dennett would say, it's all an illusion, right?
hmm
But I
hmm
don't buy that because who is it being an illusion to? Who is it seeming? Who, if someone is conscious, if it's an illusion, presumably it's seeming like someone is conscious. Like say if I'm conscious, uh, then it would say, well, you're not conscious. You only seem like you are. But then I would say to myself, oh, so it seems to me like I'm conscious, but then I would have to be conscious in order to be aware of the illusion.
Right,
You
right,
see, so
right.
so I used to buy physicalism, but not anymore. But when I
Yeah.
look at my background and I see all that complexity, I question myself, is that tiny piece of brain, that tiny sample of human cortex, is it aware of itself and aware of its environment somehow, even though it's separate from the main
Right,
cortex? You
right.
know,
Yep. So what I love about the way this conversation has begun is we've thrown ourselves into the philosophical paradoxes from the very first moment. And because we have separated ourselves from two major positions. Now, you may not be speaking for yourself yet, but I have separated myself at least. We'll find out where
right,
you're at. On the one hand, promissory physicalism that just says, well, what you have in that single-celled organism is all you ever get. And
right,
what it is to be a human is not different from, fundamentally different, not metaphysically different from what it is to be that single-celled organism. The idealist will say, well, there's no dependence on physicality whatsoever. These, say, Leibniz's monads or something. There's an illusion of the physical, but no dependence on it, maybe no reality of it, not an interaction at all. Or our third, obviously, major position, the Cartesian dualism. Both exist, but they don't really interact. Um, Occasionalism in Leibniz or something like that. I think the most fascinating discussions, and your show has into these, but I'm trying to name the thing I hear over and over again
yeah,
on your podcasts, which is um, that interaction between two things, which can't be an absolute Cartesian dualism, but can't lead to the disappearance of the physical. It shouldn't lead to the disappearance of the mental. That's the argument you just gave against Dennett.
Yeah.
How do we proceed in this space? I mean, whether you're talking about um, awareness of other minds in primates, that's an amazing phenomenon. That a primate, a bonobo, is aware of the perspective of another being as a separate being. That's insane,
Yeah.
that level of sophistication. Up to, but it still interacts with the size and nature of the brain of the bonobo.
Yeah.
Up to um, highly intelligent persons experimenting with ayahuasca and having experiences of reality completely outside the norm. And in there, that's where philosophers of consciousness should sit and struggle. We're not going to find a fully adequate view, but what do we think is the most adequate view?
Yeah. It's so tricky because you look around and you see, we tend to make distinctions between animate and inanimate objects. We see living beings, and those living beings, we look at them, and like bonobos, and we see signs of them being aware of other beings and members of their species, and they also, like us, interact with our environment, the environment that we share, even though they have a different niche, or sometimes they're
Mhm.
at the zoo or whatever. But um we see we perceive objects, and I'm wondering, okay, it looks like some of those objects, the inanimate ones, are unconscious and others are conscious. They move around and they look like living beings, life forms, right? But then I think to myself, I hear someone like Bernardo Castro, for example, and he's an idealist, analytic idealism, and he says that what we see, it's almost Kantian. He says that what we see is only what the world looks like to us. He has this thing called the mind at large, and as human beings, we have a narrowed perspective. We only see certain things, and what we see, it's a bit like Donald Hoffman. What we see around us are only symbols on a desktop. We don't get the
Mhm.
full picture. So someone like Kastrup would say, when you look at a bonobo, you see um, the mind of a bonobo, you only see a partial version, or a symbol for the mind of a bonobo. It's what the mind of a bonobo looks like to a human being, and hence we see the form of a bonobo. If we open the bonobo's head, we might see the bonobo's brain and neurons and so forth. So he says that all we see are images, just representations of mind, and mind is the fundamental, uh, you know, mind is basically the essence of reality.
Mhm.
What do you make of all that? I mean,
Let's grant Kastrup the thesis that the way that the world is experienced by different creatures or individual humans is vastly different and probably incomprehensible to those outside of its mind.
yeah,
That seems completely plausible and defensible view. Now let's look at the two positions next to him, which I think aren't. Consciousness is so universal that every being has it and every being is looking through the same window, as it were. No, 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 more complicated than that. Physicality plays no role in these differences. It just happens that their blick, their particular view, is unique. Not as plausible. Okay, on the other hand, they don't really have a perspective at all. They
right.
just have a particular physical construct and act in certain ways. So a kind of behaviorism of the mental. That seems less adequate. So I kind of feel that in the first 5 or 7 minutes, we're already in that place of the most productive philosophical reflection and
I hope
indeed
so.
of mystery and mystery at the same time. And probing that. So what I mean, I'd say the two strangest, and I'm going to add a third in a moment. The two strangest things on the table already between us are that the physical would play and physical differences would play an essential role in something that seems so non-physical, like consciousness.
Yeah,
How is that possible? And second, that consciousness would be so unlike its substratum, right? There's no, in the brain behind you, this little bit of a human brain, there's no, if I say that I happen to know that that was my brain. And the moment they took that section, I was thinking of Brahman in the Hindu tradition, or I was thinking of a great cup of coffee as soon as this neurosurgery is over,
Right.
right? That seems
Yeah.
so vastly different. And that's where I'd love us to probe to see if we can get a little bit further on, do we call it interactionism of the two? Or
Right.
are in the end, are we going to say that one is far more real than the other? That's sort of the question I would like to ask. If it's a sort of continuum.
Right. Yeah. There have to be a dichotomy between the two, or
Okay, go on.
can
Go
it
on.
can it all be just one but manifesting in different ways or expressing itself in different ways? I think of the absolute. I keep hearing this absolute idealism. I'm still learning about it, but this absolute, um, is it what some people refer to as gods, or and does it can it actually precede consciousness itself, or is it already imbued with consciousness, or is it consciousness already? Because to me, consciousness seems somehow irreducible. It's like without consciousness, nothing can be said to exist, and it's so strange. I've wrestled with it sometimes. Um, but then when I think of the absolute, I think of a dichotomy where it includes consciousness, and consciousness can come in many forms. It can get very complex. It can generate all manner of beings, and these beings can have vastly different minds. And I think to myself, if we say that the absolute, do we have evidence for that absolute? I mean, we can look at objects in our waking lives. But then I think of dreams. And in dreams, we also can perceive objects and we can believe those objects to be real, only to wake up and realize, oh God, that was my own creation. It was an illusion of the mind. It was all mental. And I think to myself, maybe this is also mental and these objects are just illusory. They're not, there's when we talk of physicality, perhaps that's the story we tell ourselves. Perhaps it's only an adjective for how certain mental states or mental activity, or like for how certain appearances in the world feel to us. It feels solid. It burns. It's cold to the touch. And I think to myself, we have these adjectives, and are we allowing language to dictate to us what reality is really like? Are we being misled by our own, semantics?
Mhm.
It makes me, it's a roller coaster, isn't it?
Yeah. So you've laid out for us a beautiful three-point agenda, and let's see how much of it we can get through. You started your comment by saying maybe this relationship between consciousness and world is fundamental, and that one sees it from the very first organisms through the bonobos all the way up to the most sophisticated humans, be they scientists or mystics. And I think we should take a look at that for a moment. And then what would lead us to introduce consciousness as somehow prior?
Right.
Having some independent existence, not being merely a derivative of a physical world. That was the second part of your
Yeah.
line of thought.
Yeah.
And then, if we have reason to introduce it as separate, thirdly, would we call it the absolute? Would we call it God? What would we give it primacy? Would we be an idealist of one flavor or another? Let's just go through those briefly so that we and your listeners can get clear on that.
Yeah.
So the very first one is you said, and I really liked it as a great and a sort of empirical but non-reductionist way to start, which you said maybe for in every case, human being, the dude behind you with the brain, may he rest in peace,
Yeah.
and the single-celled organism, there is an interaction between what we could say is we could say a perspective. That's a really interesting neutral word. We don't say that we
Yeah.
know what it's like to be um, an ape, um, but we say that there is a perspective even of a single-celled organism. It exists in a place, it has a task to stay alive and thrive, awareness or not. We'll get back to the phenomenology.
Yeah.
So let's just look at that. I actually think that that would be for a non-closed-minded philosopher one of the most interesting places to start to get grounded in this whole discussion of consciousness, because we could study it almost ad infinitum from the first organism through the development of reptilian brain and how their interactions change for these to, the beginning of a nervous system, a cortex of some sort, some
Yeah.
memory, um, the sense of a perspective of others. We have evidence of that in dogs and bonobos and others. The beginning of consciousness. We could look at um, ontogeny, the development of an individual, and how that consciousness changes over time. And in every case, our cardinal rule is we're asking, how does this perspective that the organism person has and the surrounding world, how does it manifest? And then
Yeah.
we're kind of empirical students of consciousness because we're looking at the way that they emerge. Okay, I'm going to
Yeah.
pause and see what your response is to that and then move on to the next part. Like, does that draw you? You're the one who introduced it, Alindo, so you can't
Yeah,
blame
that's
me.
right. Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. Um, it makes me think of one of the definitions of consciousness that Thomas Nagel came up with, which was, what is it like to be? And he used the
The
bat,
bat,
yeah,
right?
as an example. What is it like to be a bat? And I think to myself, well, in order to know what it's like to be a bat, you'd have to be the bat in order to fully understand. So I think to myself, is consciousness, in terms of that kind of consciousness, that flavor, the mind of a bat. I don't know if we can, if in this
Yeah,
case we can use mind and
yes.
consciousness interchangeably. But
Let's do it for now. Yes.
okay, let's say the mind of a bat, is it forever unreachable to human beings? Is it a bit like, I think of Kant. There's the thing in itself, and maybe we can never reach it. But then it makes me think, well, the thing in itself can't use to say that all we get is appearances. It's how things seem to us, but we can never know the thing in itself, right? So if we look at the bat as a thing in itself, how can we possibly make statements about the bat? It's
Right.
it's so difficult, and you know, eh, and
But
also I have another bone to pick with Kant because it seems, at least maybe not with Kant, but interpretations of Kant by certain people, because a lot of people say, well, um, all you can know is there's the noumena and then there's the phenomena, right? And he used to say, well, some people who interpret Kant, at least how I began to learn it, and then I changed my mind on it, was, well, the noumena is what you can't reach, you can't go there, right? And the phenomenal is the world of appearances, um, as they appear to you. And I think to myself, well, after reading, say, interpretations of Schopenhauer, it seems like Schopenhauer inverted those interpretations of Kant, because I'm not sure what Kant was really saying. And it seems like Schopenhauer was saying, well, the noumenal or the noumenon is consciousness because it's the only thing that we can be sure of with 100% certainty. And the world out there is what's phenomenal. And it seems to be like an inversion, or like he's flipped it on its head. At least is flipped the Kantian interpretations on their head
hmm
to say
hmm
that it's the reverse. It's consciousness that we can be sure of, and therefore that's the noumenon, and everything else, every other appearance is phenomenal, and that's what we can't know for sure, other than perhaps to imply that it arises out of consciousness. And then it makes me think of someone I looked up, which is Adi Shankara, who
Oh
used
yeah.
to, who used the clay pot analogy. basically everything's consciousness. He used to say the forms, what they have in common is clay, and therefore the forms are transient, illusory, and the ultimate reality is clay. There is only clay, and clay was synonymous with mind.
Mhm.
Uh, what would you make of that? I
So
mean,
when we get to absolute idealism,
yeah,
then I'd love to talk about Shankara and the debate with Ramanuja, because in Vedanta Hinduism, it is some ways more sophisticated than anything that took place in the West, understanding the nature of what an absolute consciousness would be. Also, the Kant we have to put off for a little bit, because once we get to absolute idealism, then Kant rears his ugly head and we can see how he attacks that position. But I don't want to lose the clarity that we reached in the beginning of your previous comment,
yeah, go
which
for it.
is to say that we see around us a very large number of identifiable beings. They have bodies, and we have reason to think that they are aware of their surroundings in one way or another, right? If you move toward a little tiny lizard in the on the ground, he's gonna run away. So in a simple way, he's aware of you. We don't know the nature of that awareness. We like that skeptical hypothesis, but we
Yeah,
know that we have evidence that there's an awareness and that those become more complex in more beings with more complex brains, but that seems to be relatively universal across beings. So what we've done is demystified the way that we introduce consciousness. And I think a person with an open mind might say, yeah, there's some kind of awareness going on. And you guys are saying it's really hard to say what the nature of that awareness is for a bat. But there seems to be, bats seem to have a similar kind of awareness, right? If we can do the same empirical things, they respond in similar ways. We don't know what that awareness is, but there are similarities within a species, for example.
yeah,
And the Martian who comes and finds humanity and experiments on us says, well, yeah, they have some similarities. For example, when you cut off their hand, they scream loudly or something,
yeah,
but they also have some kind of awareness that I don't have access to. I think that's a brilliant starting point for the whole debate. Okay,
yeah.
now let's begin to ask, so what is this awareness? And that was the second point. And we just want to see the transition from what we just got, which is a nice empirical approach to consciousness, but without reductionism. I think
Right.
that's a rich area for philosophers and scientists to sort of walk some common ground. And we could come back to that again and again. We know right where we are, what the kind of questions we're asking. The two people we don't invite into our club are the reductive physicalist who says there is no awareness whatsoever. We think that's not a good hypothesis.
Yeah,
And right now we're not letting in the idealist because we think an actual relationship with an actual world is part of the nature of this diverse awareness that we find
yeah.
around us. The John Templeton Foundation has an actual research project called Diverse Intelligences. Nope, it's the Templeton Charity Research, TWCF,
Right.
Templeton World Charity Foundation. And it's really worth looking at the interesting empirical data they've gathered. Okay, so we can set that aside unless you bring us back to it. Then we have the tendency to link this awareness, at least in the human case, to something that is not a combination of a body and a perspective, is my way of hinting at
Right.
consciousness. So, for example, maybe there's a creator intelligence that launched the whole bloody thing in the beginning. Maybe everything is actually consciousness primarily, and the physicality is derivative. So, Shankara, right?
Yeah.
And we have thousands of other options of how that might work. And now what we've done, we haven't negated our starting point. We've been led as philosophers to a new point where we start to ask, well, could consciousness have some reality that is not dependent on perspectivalism? That is,
Yeah.
on the perspective or standpoint of a given embodied agent. And that one I think I'd want to spend a little time to, if you have any interest there. And then the final
Sure.
question is, so when you get to consciousness as such, what's its nature? How can we think about it? And those are where some of the really fat, and do we have access to it through lucid dreaming or psychedelic experience or any other, as your title says, experiential form of a
Yeah.
realism about consciousness? But
Yeah,
let's just see if there are any problems for you in that, or how you would make that movement from just a perspective of embodied being, kind of really
yeah.
generic, to a kind of primacy of this question of consciousness or awareness. Like
Let-
how do you get to that primacy?
right. Let's say we have an embodied being and we we rely on behavior, behaviorism to an extent. We
Hmm.
see how that creature behaves, and then we make assumptions about the mental states. I mean, it might be easier to guess what's going on with a human internally because we are human beings. Um, but we also know it's possible for that human to be completely still, to be paralyzed under general anesthesia, and something goes wrong with the chemicals, and that person is completely aware of what's going on, and they want to alert the doctors to the fact that they're still conscious, they're not completely under. But to everybody else, it looks like that person is already unconscious. So we know it's possible for consciousness to exist without us being aware of it. So we can't rely so much on behaviorism. Um, and sometimes, according you know, to somnambulism, they say you get some spikes, but it's mostly delta sleep brainwaves, and yet the person is moving around and doing complex tasks, and apparently they're not really aware of what they're doing or what's going
Yeah.
on, or perhaps they are, but they don't remember upon waking up. So there's a great deal of um,
So I want to say that's
aspect.
brilliant. I don't want to lose that point. That's brilliant
Sure.
because you show that something's this is we have a three-phase approach to this. We did the kind of perspectives of bodies, different animals. And now you said there seems to be evidence that something more is going on. In phase two of our study, we have, and we could go on and on, we have dreams that seem to have access to a kind of reality that isn't a part of the day-by-day interaction with the world. In psychedelic experiences, we have experiences of access to realms that seem utterly different and mystical experiences. Look at William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. Still
Yeah,
worth going back to and reading those stories.
yeah,
Brilliantly written. Something else going on. And then if you get to the near-death experiences, you've talked about that on other shows.
that's right. Yeah,
Whatever, true or
we can
false,
cover that. We can cover that.
no, we don't need to, but just trying to get a list of what
Yeah,
takes us to phase two of the discussion. And
yeah.
these are contested, every one of them. But when you add up all the examples, then I think we have a strong case that the philosopher needs to go there. The philosopher needs to stop and say, well, what the hell are going on in these kinds of cases?
Yeah.
And then we have traditions in indigenous peoples and Hindu traditions of traveling in an astral body, so not a physical body, to other places and dimensions, and having experiences, and then bringing those back to the body and making them part of one's teaching. Okay, so do we have let's actually say we're not going to deal with the skeptic right now. We're just going to begin to be phenomenologists in this phase two of, what is going on in these cases, and what would the philosopher say consciousness is if it's not just that perspective of a body in a world, but it is also having something like these properties that emerge in the various cases that I just listed. And that's a
Right.
place to be really disciplined as a philosopher. What can we say? What do we know? What don't we know? Where I don't like if you think back over all the shows from 7 years, where has that taken you in terms of this phase two? There's something more that is more than just the perspective of a body.
Right. I okay, I don't want to use the reductionist approach, but let's
Mhm.
say consciousness in its simplest form is basically the potential to be aware. And me and you and everyone else have that in common. So already we're united by that one thing. We can identify with that. So in a sense, we could say that we're all the same. And
Including
then
animals, right, Arledo?
including
This.
animals, yeah,
Okay,
including
okay,
animals, yeah.
okay.
Any sentient being, any sentient creature, we're identified with them. We're all in this together. But obviously, we've taken different paths, and we've encountered different environments. we've led different lives, and it's shaped our minds. So we have different content, but at the bottom, let's say, we're still all aware. We're always aware of something. So we have that in common. We have the capacity to be aware of things that come within our purview. And if we have that in common, and let's leave out unconsciousness, but if we always have the capacity to be aware of something, and let's leave out the nature of time for now, because if people say, oh, you can be conscious 1 minute and then the next minute you can be unconscious, because we can see that you've lost your senses, you've collapsed on the floor, therefore we can say that you were unconscious for half an hour. But when the person wakes up, they might say, oh, I collapsed 1 minute and I woke up the next. So there's a continuity of consciousness. There's no unconsciousness there from that perspective, from that
Yep.
person's perspective,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So let's say it's just consciousness, but we all perceive things differently, and sometimes we can agree with one another, and sometimes we can disagree, and then we get different groups of people with different ideas, and we can clash. But we are always united by that one consciousness, right?
Oh, well,
And
that's interesting. Everything you said so far was phase one consciousness studies, perspectives. But you just said, but we are all united by that one consciousness. And that moves you firmly into stage two of consciousness studies. So then the philosopher asked you, what do you mean by that one consciousness? There's a kind of universal mental field and we're united by it? Or what do you like? Just help me understand your last sentence.
right, I would say that when we talk about consciousness and we're thinking of the capacity to be aware, and that very thing that can know other things, that knowing, um you know that consciousness is only one thing, it's only one phenomenon. And I mean to say that I'm not talking about different flavors of consciousness. I'm not talking about the difference between human minds and animal minds,
Yeah,
and
that was phase one. We already dealt with that one.
yeah,
We
we
already,
dealt with that. I'm talking about awareness itself,
yes,
because
that's the
if we,
question.
yeah, if we talk of awareness, we can't talk of another awareness, because we're talking of the same thing. So it has to be one thing. And
That's
if
good. That's
if
good.
and if
It's a
I'm
good
aware,
argument.
and if
Yeah.
and you're aware, then me and you, we're the same. We might be obviously separate. I'm Arlindo, you're Professor Philip Clayton, but we have that, we have, and in a sense we can say we are, because that's all we know. We can only be aware of ourselves, who we are right now in our environments, through awareness.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so
Right.
let's take a so we've moved beyond perspectivalism, phase one consciousness studies, and now we've asked the question, what is consciousness as such? And the way that you introduced it just now is very similar to Descartes' cogito ergo sum.
Yeah.
So I think, and by this is I'm aware, I have awareness, ergo sum, therefore I am aware that I exist. So the statement I exist already puts us in this phase two. It's something that consciously or not, any being could say, no matter how vastly different their sense of the I is. So what usually happens at this point is people go racing off into a single school, including some of your guests in the past. Whereas
Yeah.
I think that we should be a little bit more careful and say, so we both, I think you're not just role playing, that we think that there is a phase two consciousness studies, and we ask, what is that, may I say, common feature or even unified feature of all states of, and let me just throw in conscious awareness, because there may be pre-conscious awareness, and we're going to set that aside for a moment, of conscious awareness. Um, so some, I know how to do it. Some of those lead us to a phase three where we're asking about the absolute consciousness, a God, um, panpsychism, a sort of universal metaphysical theory about it.
Yeah.
Others, however, don't lead us to yet another phase. They say, hey guys, the reflection stops here. The only thing we can really talk about critically is these common features of consciousness. So I'm a phase two consciousness studies guy. but I absolutely won't go on to phase three. I think that's all malarkey, right? It's
Right.
just, it's nonsense. And so I want to make sure that your listeners and that we know that there is an area of study here which reductionists like Dennett would never enter, but which is different from a kind of absolute metaphysic position. And let me just give a
Although
couple
he
of
may have entered it
examples.
by now because he passed away, didn't he? So maybe he knows the truth in a
Yeah,
different form.
touche. There you go. So let's just get, we should, between us, let's see if we can get at least three positions out. Um,
Definitely, yeah.
uh, so one would be a theory of personal awareness, so that there is something that it's like to be a bat,
Yeah.
and that is a shared feature among bats, something that's like to be a tiger, something that is like to be a human. We get this even back to Strawson. We get lots of reflection on the nature of human personhood. So, um, and for everything that's as complex as we are or more, there's an awareness of our awareness. So we'll call it self-consciousness. And now we have a whole area. In a sense, this is what phenomenology has done all along. Think of its
Right, yeah.
birth in Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, through the 20th century. Every case, people are saying, what is it? What is the nature of this awareness? And reflecting on it in different ways. We could do 5 shows just on the
We
various
could.
theories
I
that
could have you
come.
back if you want at some point in
Yeah.
the future.
All right. But let's just say everyone and the Hindu would do it, and you might have that reflection as a Taoist in advanced work begins to wonder what is the state of wu-wei, or um, active non-action, or the Zen Buddhist monk in Japan in long hours of meditation comes to know what it is to be the phenomenology of being fully in this moment, or in Theravadan Buddhism, on a 30-day silent retreat, a monk finds himself, in this case, um, experiencing the loss of individual identity and the experiential recognition of the oneness of all consciousness. I'm a drop in an infinite sea, right? All this is phase two consciousness studies
Yeah,
and we
yeah.
haven't laid any metaphysical foundation for what the hell is going on here. We're just kind of looking at perspectives to understand what this phenomenon of consciousness is. Let me just
That's
stop there
right.
and see if that is an area of philosophical inquiry makes sense to you, or is it contradictory in
No,
some way?
it certainly makes sense, and the reason why I've become interested in this is because I've been practicing meditation and lucid dreaming for about 15 years now, and I remember very distinctly it was the only time when I stumbled upon this. It was like a pure awareness,
Yeah.
and basically I all the memories, all the thoughts just disappeared. It's almost like I wasn't human anymore. I had no recollection of being human, nothing. And yet it was this bliss. For some reason, it was blissful, a
Yeah.
blissful stillness uh, of awareness. I can't describe it because when I describe it, it's not the thing. It's like
Yeah,
a narrative,
absolutely.
a story
Yeah,
of the
because you're
thing.
bringing distinctions. But what that is a brilliant example. Actually, that would be the paradigm example of phase two consciousness studies. If you start to ask, well, it has the dimension of bliss, which is ananda in Sanskrit, you
Yeah,
move into phase three. So we're going to hold back just for a moment, because what you've done is the classic philosophical expression of this phase two consciousness studies. It our inquiry began with different beings with different perspectives to their surrounding world. And then philosophically, the mystics do the same thing, by the way,
yeah,
and seekers. We move to say, so what might be shared between in these every instance of awareness of one's environment or awareness of oneself? And I think I would like to use the word consciousness as such, consciousness without distinction.
yeah,
And many people in lucid dreaming or mystical experiences have experiences of that. But philosophically, it makes all the sense in the world to say, what's the substratum? If there are thousands of examples of awareness in phase one, what's the substratum is awareness as such.
yeah.
And what
That's
can
right.
and what qualities does it have? That might drive us to phase three. Or maybe there's a kind of phenomenology we can do of awareness, of lucid dreaming, of psychedelic experiences, where in that kind of beautiful, neutral, describing way, one can describe what it is like to have consciousness in general. Let me see,
Yeah.
just see where that takes you, and then we should move to phase three.
I couldn't tell you why it felt blissful. Um, and it was like awareness and it was just awareness. And I couldn't tell you why it was blissful other than to say that perhaps I was free of all concepts. It was like a freedom. There's no more narratives, no more nightmares, no more identification with anything. It's just, I guess it was kind of like a freedom, as best as I can describe it. And the thing is, I wasn't even, although you could class it as meditation, but I was trying to do a technique to induce wake initiated lucid dream. And basically, I was laying in bed and I was just focusing on a lamp in my mind. And as I was focusing on the lamp, my mind couldn't keep still. Several thoughts just kept flaring up. And sometimes I would get lost, but then I would bring my mind back to the point of focus, which was the lamp. And I kept doing it very patiently, very patiently. Every time he gets lost, bring it back to focus. Gets lost, bring it back to focus. And then eventually there was like a shift in consciousness, and everything was just gone. And I felt so blissful, peaceful. I felt free, but there was still awareness. And
Yeah,
then as it went on, there was like a tiny passage of time. And then it's like the first thoughts in my head would be, what is this? Where am I? Who am I? And then I felt the need to answer those questions. And then
Mm,
those questions began to form a narrative. And then
mm.
the stream of thoughts came rushing in. And as I was flooded by the thoughts, the bliss was gone. The original
Yeah,
state was gone.
yeah.
And all I was left with were just stories or attempts or narratives trying to describe what I experienced. If I even had an eye, it was just awareness. There wasn't a, oh,
Yeah,
I'm Aldingo.
absolutely. You know,
Yes.
we should get a name for that position. Let's call it experiential realism.
Yeah.
You know, because in a sense, the title of the podcast is reflected in that individual experience.
It kind of is, yeah. Experiential realism. Yeah.
Yeah. There are thousands of accounts of meditators, lucid dreamers from every religious tradition in the world, meditators that are very similar to that, where the distinctions go away. So I'm going to say, as an advocate of phase two consciousness studies, that this is a phenomenon, this the state of consciousness without distinction
Yeah.
that seems to be a part of many human ex persons' human experience. Okay, so we could spend hours on that, but let's just say, okay, clearly you advocate phase two consciousness studies. Clearly I do. Now, why do people think that that transitions to phase three? And here's why. That the phenomenon of awareness without distinction needs to be explained. The human brain wonders, what does it tell us about the nature of ultimate reality that I could have had this experience just now? And
Yeah.
as soon as we start asking, so what is that nature that is of ultimate reality that's expressed in this state of non-distinction awareness? We're going to do phase three consciousness studies. And I will very quickly give you three different interpretations of it from across the world's traditions. So
Right.
first, the most simple maybe is classical Buddhist understanding. So back to Nagarjuna. And on this view, um, and actually, I'm just going to stick with uh, the one quality you mentioned, because it's one of the three that appear in most of the traditions, philosophical traditions of the world, which is bliss. And why the bliss, which is in our conversation, what led our conversation from phase two to phase three. The Buddhist says, because you no longer are attached to the realm of suffering, the illusion that there is suffering. Why
Oh,
is
right.
that?
Yeah.
Because you have moved beyond the illusionary circle of cause and effect. The Sanskrit word is pratitya samutpada, and I like the translation,
Right.
this being given that arises.
Right.
You fall into an illusion that everything is a cause, it has an effect, an effect, an effect, an effect, and that's the whole realm of of suffering that the Buddha helps us to get away from. So
Yeah.
now you got to a place beyond causality, like the reflection on the realm of the dead in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where you no
Right.
longer are bound to this world, and then the soul, the self, the Atman goes to, well, there's no Atman in Buddhism, but
Right.
whatever is true goes there. Okay, number two would be Shankara.
Oh,
So
chakra. Yeah.
in Vedanta, it's a position called Advaita Vedanta. So uh,
Is it like
Advaita is without
non-dualism?
distinction, a reality with no distinctions. But that is a reality that is the reality of Brahman, of this sort of ultimate consciousness. His position is called Nirguna Brahman because it is the view that Brahman has no attributes. This is beyond all attributes, which matches your experience.
Yeah.
But he also says he uses a Sanskrit word, which is actually three words put together, Satchichananda. So Brahman that has no attributes is Satchichananda, which means being, consciousness, and bliss.
Right.
Those are attributes even of undifferentiated ultimate reality. Being, and you can see why the philosopher would say, yeah, there's some being there, it's not illusion. Consciousness, there was awareness of a state beyond distinctions, and Ananda, bliss. And
Yeah.
finally, the theist would say, well, you've freed yourself from your body. You're in direct contact with a person-like being that created all things. You're in that space where you can directly access the divine spirit. And so, of course, that brings bliss. Let me just stop and see what you think about this transition from the phase two experience to a kind of philosophical reflection about what might explain it,
Right.
where it leads us. Did you tell me where it takes you?
Wow. It's definitely moving things forward. It's stepping up, and it's almost like getting a clearer picture. Um, but at the same time, there is still a sense of mystery there. But then perhaps, um, when we talk about, that pure awareness, which goes by many names,
Yeah,
there's the
yeah.
Buddhist tradition and stuff. We'll talk about that pure awareness. Perhaps that is the only possible ontological primitive. Maybe there's no further reduction beyond that. I
Okay.
don't know. I don't know.
Okay. So you just took the position, which is, I'm glad we put it on the table. Nope, Phil, you can do phase two consciousness studies. You can talk about that experience. You can work on meditation stuff, but there is no rational discourse about where it comes from or what gives rise to it. You can't go there. And many people say that. It's like phase two is as far as it goes, and this other stuff is just fantasy.
Yeah.
My counter argument would be that the movement from phase one to phase two is actually analogous to the move from two to three. So if you've made the phase one to two, you shouldn't resist this new form of reflection. And I'll just say it very, very briefly. In
Yeah.
phase one, we have just the study of multiple perspectives of multiple embodied beings or
Yeah.
species or whatever. And then you were
Yes.
willing to say, we can ask what is the unified thing that underlies it all? Consciousness. And then we looked at phase two studies.
That's
I
right.
want to say that it's very analogous to say there's this unified consciousness that many have accessed in many different ways and that manifests even in primitive ways in some people who just begin to get there, right?
Yeah.
And we are only asking now, let's ask what might explain it. So just as one gave rise to two, two gives rise to three, there's no reason to be skeptical about this discussion until we, as philosophers, at least try it.
Yeah.
Now, you might say no, or you might say, okay, I'll go with it. Are you going to do phase three consciousness studies, or you're going to say, no, I'm skeptical?
I'm gonna say let's go with it and see where it leads. And you brought up the name Brahman, Brahman, yeah, which makes me think of a totality or
Yeah, that's
everything,
it.
all there is. Would you also say that Brahman includes the infinite potential? Is it like a is it like um an infinite mind that exists and we exist within it and we separate as Atman? And would you say that Brahman is another word for God? Is it like one of the concepts of God, I'd say, because when people talk of God, people have different concepts, don't they? And they don't all
We
align.
can't say God because
Right.
that pushes the conversation into a Western framework. So we need some label for it, which doesn't beg the question against the various hypotheses that we want to look at. And I'm going to suggest that just use the two letters "you are,"
You are.
namely standing for ultimate reality.
Right.
Whatever is ultimately true, you are, is what we're asking about when we move from stage two conscious experiences to this new area of debate. It's a sort of comparative metaphysics. And I have to say, one of the sad parts of my life over the last 25 years is that I found so few people who have done the work, the empirical work of phase one, who know the various reports on experiences from across the traditions, and who know intricately multiple theories of UR across the world and across history. I can
Yeah.
think of just a small number of people who who read Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and contemporary languages and who know these views and can discuss them in a sophisticated way. And so people
Right.
just get superficial, or they fight, or they get emotional, or they retreat from phase three and just go back to their meditation, which is
Oh, right.
probably fine. But actually, there is comparative metaphysics is one of the most, especially if it's empirically grounded and experientially grounded, one of the most fascinating areas that we can work on. And I'll just mention, let's limit it to three because we're short on time.
Sure.
um, three kinds of positions one might look at. Um, Number one, there is this ultimate reality has an ultimate nature.
Yeah.
Um, and in these three views, yeah, this is good. Here are three contrasting ways or families of positions in stage three consciousness studies. So number one would be the theisms. I say that because I presume most of your listeners are in the West. And so these are notions of a being that is either a personal being, or I'm more skeptical, so I'd say not less than personal. Whatever its nature is, it is not less than what we experience as persons in the world, but presumably infinitely more. And
Yeah.
this being is sometimes seen as a creator, so a cause that sets it all in motion. It's sometimes seen as like the water in which consciousness swims, the framework.
Yeah.
So everything is located within this. People usually use the word divine in this case,
Yeah.
but the divine is also in everything. That's a position called panentheism that I've worked on in detail. So
Yeah.
everything
Makes
is
sense.
within
Yeah.
the divine, but the divine also includes all things. Um,
Right.
or
Makes
it
me
is in
think of
everything. A double in is what I call it, the in. Uh, the divine is within everything. Everything is within the divine. So
right.
there's a whole family of views that we could talk about. Okay, set them all aside now. Let's go to Brahman. This would be an understanding. Let's just take the most sophisticated of the Vedanta thinkers. Um, we've already talked about Shankara,
Yeah.
and this is Brahman without attributes, Nirguna Brahman. And then Ramanuja is an amazingly complex thinker from South India, and his is Saguna Brahman. So Brahman has attributes. We can
Right.
say something about it, but it isn't God. Like you can't just equate it with the Western God.
Right.
Okay, long discussion of those debates about in this phase three, and finally unitive positions. And so I'll just take Taoism. So in the beginning is the Tao, and then there's the two, and then the three, and then the 10,000, the Tao Te Ching says. So
Right.
there becomes distinction, yin and yang, would sometimes called the masculine feminine principle, but it's more complex than that.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
there's threeness, and then there's everything. Like there's an absolute multiplicity beyond that. But At its deepest level, they are unified without distinction. You have that in Plotinus and Neoplatonism in the West, where
Yeah, I
the
was about to
final
say.
ascent at the Enneads, you have the ascent to a place of oneness beyond nous even. It's
Yeah,
just a absolute oneness. Um, it came into German idealism with Lessing, of whom it was reported after his death in the 1762 or something.
right.
Um, they said, are you really a Spinozist? So this is Spinoza now, but
Yeah,
it leads back to Plotinus. And he said, allegedly, Hen kai pan, I know no other. Hen,
right.
it means the one and all. Hen, one, pan, all. The one and all is
And
the
all.
ultimate. I know nothing else.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
that
so
makes
there's
perfect
this
sense.
third category that has it always starts with absolute unity. Um, let me stop right there and see where that takes you. Three
Yeah,
major
it,
views
it
in
makes me
stage
think of
three consciousness studies.
yeah, it makes me think of pantheism, and you can also be a panentheist. And all these traditions and everything you've been saying reminds me of Neoplatonism, and you get the what you call the nous. We say nous here, but yeah, it's the same thing. And then it leads to the realm of Plato's perfect forms, which I think it's like a divine reality, and then that the one basically creates emanations, doesn't it? And the
That's
more
right,
it
exactly.
emanates, it creates imperfect copies of itself, and through the world soul, I think it was, through the world soul, the world soul gets information from that divine reality, and then this information gets projected. That's how the world soul creates the sense world, which is an imperfect copy of that divine reality. And then
Yep,
you get the manifestation of space and time and objects and everything else. And
yep.
and and it makes me think, oh yeah, and according to Neoplatonists, the when things are emanated, the emanations they happen outside temporality, because basically space and time they're both projections, they're not fundamental. And I'm wondering, do you agree with that? Because a lot of people tend to say, oh, it feels like time is more fundamental than that, but I'm thinking, based on Neoplatonism, which seems to make sense, time is more like an illusion that needs to be felt like it's a reality in this world in order for things to make
Now be
sense.
careful, for an emanation is not unreal in and of itself. It's only unreal compared to the Hin Kai Pan, the absolute one
Yes,
at the
that's
top.
right. That's right.
So it's
Yeah, I was
not
about to say,
Kantianism. It's not the same as Kant.
right, yeah, because after all, time feels real. So in a sense, it is real. And then it makes me think, oh, what is real? How do we define as real? Is it what makes an appearance? What we're conscious of?
And that's what's beautiful about
Yeah,
consciousness studies, that we
yeah,
took a very careful path through it and we came to the most amazing questions that philosophers have ever asked, arising out of our single-celled organism in the beginning, or the neurons behind you on the
that's
screen.
right. Yeah, yeah,
So it took us all the way there. So I know we're short on time. As a comparative
sure.
metaphysician, I could talk for 3 hours without ever taking a particular position. But I sometimes think that that's cowardly. So I'll tell you my position
Yeah,
just as a basis, and then maybe you'll want to say something about your own, and then we can
sure. And,
take
and
a
then we're
put in
done.
a
And
semicolon at that point. And
sure.
that is, I find Plotinus and similar positions less satisfying than a different understanding of you are. And the reason is that the ultimate does not share qualities that we think are most distinctive about ourselves, and that an ultimate reality sh can't explain them unless it is an instantiation of them. And among that, I think of um, qualities that we think of the most advanced forms of a personal being. So those would include relationality, being related to others, awareness or consciousness, knowing that one is related, knowing that one knows. Um, yeah, sense of connection, and consciousness. So I find a metaphysic that leaves these phenomena that you explore in this show unaccounted for less satisfying. So my view is is a is a kind of transpersonal theism where that's good. I haven't used that term before. That the ultimate is not less than personal. So it includes the UR includes every one of the most advanced experiences and concepts that we have, and yet is infinitely more.
Yeah,
So it isn't the negation of all qualities like Maimonides, the Jewish mystical thinker, but it is actually the affirmation of them and the sense that we can't comprehend the way in which those come together in you are. So it's the absence of qualities that would be classically Buddhist view. It's the um, pleroma, the fullness
the
of
pleroma.
qualities
Yeah, that's right.
but
Yeah,
in a way that we ourselves won't conceive. So I'm actually drawn to, say, the medieval Catholic mystics who are John of the Cross, but mostly women like Teresa of Avila and so forth, that we could go into that, that they move closer and closer, the seven houses, remember, in
yeah,
Teresa, Saint Teresa, and to all these qualities, and then they get to a point where an experience takes place that is unitive, like your experience, but
yeah,
doesn't lead us to say the you are is a nothingness, that would be Buddhist, but rather it's a complete fullness of all being, all things, all possibilities. And that's where
yeah.
I would come down as the end. What I find philosophically and personally, I guess, experientially, as the most powerful hypothesis in phase three consciousness studies.
Yes, perfect. And it would always be a hypothesis, really, because I think when it comes to the infinite and you are, um, us humans, we're so finite, so limited that perhaps every narrative that we come up with can never fully capture, um, you know, you are. We can only have, uh, what shall we say, like an intuition that such
Mhm.
a thing is possible, or something that would completely blow our minds that we can't fully comprehend, but we can have an idea, a
Yep.
vague idea.
One philosopher calls it intimations of transcendence.
That's it, intimation.
And a beautiful poem by Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, speaks of, quote, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused,
Right,
whose dwelling place is the round air and the ocean and in the mind of man.
right.
So all of them saying we get intimations as philosophers, we struggle, but we also face, we thought consciousness was bloody difficult. Now look at this question about you are, it's even more difficult.
Yeah.
Therefore, I love when you say, yeah, hypothesis is the best we can do.
Um,
How's that for a stopping place?
no, that's brilliant. That's perfect. I'll tell you what, before I let you go, was Whitehead an idealist? Because he talked about processes and he moved away from physicalism, didn't he? So
Yeah.
he makes me think, what are those processes made of? Because he used to say those processes can be best defined by how they relate to other processes. And I'm thinking, what's
Yeah.
moving?
Right. And we didn't do justice to idealism because of the way we began with a much more embodied approach
Sure.
in phase one. So we
Perhaps
left
next
him
time.
out. Whitehead, his fundamental reality is actual occasions. Again, I'm taking Process and Reality from 1929 as his core text. That's controversial as well.
Right.
So everything that exists is something like a mental moment. He calls it a prehension. And what we are is a series of occasions or events, mental events, as it were.
Yeah.
And he tries to say, well, it's enough to include the physical world. My view is that he doesn't succeed, that his position is more like Leibniz, whom he hated. But rather
Right.
than Leibniz's monads were cut off
Monads.
from
Yeah.
all others, it is relationality is fundamental. So in that sense, it's the opposite of Leibniz. But they
Right.
do seem to be more mental than physical. That's why his view so strongly supports panpsychism. That's a whole debate, but it is one of the strongest metaphysics in support of panpsychism. However, it is not clear that it does justice to the non-psychic, namely electrons. He says every electron is an actual occasion. I think that doesn't make sense. So
Right.
I hold a proto-panpsychism position in the books and articles I've published on that topic,
Perfect
pushing back
clarification.
against the Whiteheadians.
Yeah.
Even though I spent 20 years at Claremont School of Theology, which is the mecca of process theology, process thought. John
Right.
Cobb, David Ray Griffin, and the Center for Process Studies, which I strongly encourage people to check out, remains a center where these questions are being debated with great sophistication today.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much for all your input, Professor. And you're quite welcome to come back to
Uh-huh.
the show when we can continue this at some point. You know, it doesn't have to be straight away if you're busy, but it's certainly interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I
well,
want to explore
let's
well,
see if your listeners find it helpful or not. But tthanks for leading us in a great discussion, Orlando.
definitely, and
I
they will.
really
They
enjoyed it.
love this. M Most of them are philosophers or like fledglings, but they're getting there, and some are really into this, so they will enjoy it, and they will be discussing this on several groups on Facebook and
Cool.
YouTube, certainly YouTube. So, yeah,
I'll
it's
listen
it's
in.
been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks so
Take care.
much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Until next time.